I was honestly really surprised to find out that Cipher's addition to Honkai Star Rail means that the Nihilty path is tied for the most characters in the game right now, alongside Destruction. That'll change very soon, but it's still interesting. I think it feels wrong because Nihilty units are basically split into two categories, being damage amplifying debuffers and DOT DPSs. Technically, they are both under the Nihilty umbrella because they all do have debuffs in their kits somewhere, but they really could not play any more differently, unlike the other paths, which generally stick to a consistent formula. Well, besides Remembrance, of course. DOT might be on a comeback soon with Kafka's buffs and Hycelin's as a possible new bleed DOT user in 3.5 because she's physical, but the other half still continues to be in a pretty bad spot within the game's design. You might think that's a weird thing to say because we just got Cipher, who has some really unique and interesting gameplay. But the more you look into the fine details of her kit, the more you realize just how many hoops the design team had to jump through to put her on par with other characters due to the many inherent drawbacks Nihilty has. But before that, this video is sponsored by Opera GX. Everyone's gacha gaming experience is completely unique because everyone has different characters that they think are worth pulling on. Why not make your online browsing experience just as customizable with GX mods? You won't have to deal with any RNG, as there are tons of official and user-generated mods out there for completely free. Genshin, Star Rail, or Zenless Zone Zero, they really have everything. Adjust things like your wallpaper, background music, keyboard and tab sounds, splash screen, and icons exactly to your liking. With Opera GX, you never have to feel conflicted between playing a game or watching a video, as you can easily do both at the same time with the built-in video pop-out feature. If you feel skeptical about making the switch from your previous browser, Opera GX makes it super easy by providing a settings importer that can migrate all your browsing history and bookmarks in just a few clicks. You can download Opera GX for completely free using the link in the description or in the pinned comment. Thank you to Opera GX for supporting the channel. It wouldn't be a profound statement to say that effect hit rate as a stat is pretty awful in basically every way possible. Its purpose is to increase the chance of a debuff application landing by taking the base chance, determined by the ability used, then increasing it by multiplying the character's effect hit rate stat, while simultaneously decreasing by multiplying the enemy's effect resistance stat. So for example, a 100% base chance debuff against an enemy with 40% effect resistance, which is the standard for endgame bosses, requires 66.7% effect hit rate to be a guaranteed application. Conceptually, this is a fine idea, though the lack of information in-game regarding how it works does already make it a source of confusion. Every character in Star Rail scales off of particular stats to make them perform better with higher level, upgraded builds, and stronger teammate buffs. Everyone generally wants speed, but DPSs also need attack and crit, healers want HP, and shielders want defense. Harmony units aren't as straightforward, so the devs just opted to have each one scale with whatever stat they're boosting, such as crit damage or break effect. Nihilty could have went the same direction with their debuffs, reducing enemy stats more based on the applicator stats, but they ultimately decided to go with effect hit rate. Maybe it's because they thought direct stat scaling could lead to unintended behavior like reducing an enemy's attack or speed to 0 with a strong enough build, or maybe they just wanted debuffs to scale in a unique way. In the end, effect hit rate certainly does fill the role of a stat which debuffer type units can make use of, but the way it uniquely functions has no real upsides and some pretty big downsides. The way it works means that it acts more so as a threshold compared to the typical proportional scaling. I mean, sure, you could play without your debuffs being guaranteed, but for most characters this completely ruins the flow of their gameplay. Like if Pela misses the application for her 40% defense shred on her ultimate, you won't get another chance to try again for a few turns. So that leads to the case where EHR is very important for your debuffer's consistency, but at the same time, even a single percent more than the guaranteed threshold is completely useless. This feels especially annoying to build around with the torture that is relic subset rolls, but also the game doesn't tell you how much you'll need or how much is excess, whereas every other stat you want as much as possible. Even speed with its breakpoints gets value out of small additions over the course of many turns. Because of this, each debuffer ceiling was more or less defined at the time of their release, making their utility basically impossible to indirectly buff with new teammates or equipment. It's not a coincidence that both of the limited 5-star Nihilty characters from version 1 make up half of the 3.4 direct buff list. In a broader context, effect hit rate also stands out because of how insanely exclusive it is. Out of the 12 available relic substats, it is by far the most useless one, as it literally does not do a single thing for the majority of characters on the roster who don't have debuffs with a % chance of landing. Even the other less usable substats like break effect and effect resistance are still at the very least capable of contributing something to every character. In the game's early era, it was a little bit different, as we had some non-Nihilty characters with % chance debuffs. For example, Himeko's Fire DOT had a 50% base chance on her attacks, which didn't contribute much damage on its own, but increased her skill damage by 20%. Then we also had Danhung Slow, which has a 100% base chance to reduce speed when critting, which was also relevant for his personal damage. A handful only have it as a part of their technique's effect. This did succeed in making it feel less bad when getting effect hit rate on a piece for one of these units, but at the same time, it was difficult to justify intentionally building it due to the value of raw offensive stats. In the end, having these RNG aspects made these characters more inconvenient to use than they really should have been, because occasionally a core part of their gameplay design would miss and have zero effect due to pure luck. The devs clearly recognized this, so for future characters that very obviously wanted to build other stats over effect hit rate, they made it so their debuffs would always be applied guaranteed, not a single mention of a base chance. Take for example Gallagher, who already wants to build outgoing healing, speed, and break effect, so having his ultimate and enhanced basic attacks debuffs be guaranteed without any EHR makes him overall very consistent. This would be the first of many steps towards making the stat less of a frustration to have to deal with, but at the same time making it more and more irrelevant. Nihilty characters are forced to use effect hit rate because they're the only characters it makes sense on, but needing it is strictly a downgrade compared to other characters who don't. It would be one thing if particularly strong effects were balanced out by inconsistency, but you're intended to have guaranteed debuffs with enough EHR, so that'll never be the case. Another design trick they used was adding additional scaling to specific characters to make EHR scale more similarly to other stats, as seen with Black Swan's increased damage percent and Zhao Chou's attack boost. There is still an upper limit, as is typical with keeping these kinds of alternate scalings in check, but they're high enough to where you are much less likely to hit that stat ceiling, and you're focusing most of your effort into that one stat. These two are getting a bit old by this point though, crazy as it is to say, so how have the more recent debuffers managed to deal with effect hit rate? Well, they more or less completely ignore it. Fugue and Cipher are surprisingly similar in this respect. They each only have one debuff in their kits that has a % chance of landing, and that base chance is high enough to where an EHR body relic covers most of what they need. But also, if you were to run into the small chance of not hitting it, it's not nearly as big of a deal because these debuffs take up a relatively small portion of their overall kit. The majority of their usefulness comes from their effects that are guaranteed by them just existing on the field, with Fugue's second toughness bar for enemies allowing for double breaks, and Cipher's 40% increased damage taken by enemies, on top of the true damage ultimate stacks she accumulates from the team's damage. In fact, the game doesn't even recommend that you build effect hit rate on Cipher to begin with. Not having to build much effect hit rate also frees them up to build the other stats they much prefer for their own kits, in part due to the bonuses they get from their Ascension passives. Not having to deal with EHR is certainly one driving reason for the change in debuffer design, but there's also the general downsides of debuffs as a mechanic too. The big one is that having it be applied to enemies can heavily interrupt the uptime on your damage amp without it really being in your control. If you defeat an enemy and they get replaced, those new enemies won't have the same debuffs on them, but if you are using any modern Harmony unit, you'll have 100% uptime on your buffs no matter what the enemy lineup looks like. Zhao Chou has some personal mechanics to help deal with this, but that's only for him. It seems like recently they've made it so bosses when transitioning to their second health bar don't automatically lose all of their debuffs like before, which is a step in the right direction, but it's not quite universally consistent yet. For the rest of the cast, Harmony has this big inherent advantage, yet Nihilty and debuffs as a mechanic simply doesn't have an equivalent upside within the same role of damage amplification. Before Ronmei, limited turn buffs would expire really quickly on faster attackers, giving debuffs that acted independent of your DPS's turns a situational edge. However, both paths have essentially converged on the same design of powerful team-wide damage amplification with easy 100% uptime, making them feel much less distinct from one another. Sure, they still technically differ in affecting teammates or enemies, but functionally, they might as well be the same. After double checking, that's not exactly true either. In the end, the discussion always seems to come back around to power creep. At the start of the game's lifespan, the 7 paths were balanced fairly well. Each had unique situations they thrive in, so team building encouraged mixing and matching from a wide variety of characters. However, in order to sell new units, they need to be strong, and one aspect of character strength is how easy they are to use. But once a top tier sets a new standard, the next characters have to follow suit, ultimately resulting in the homogenization of the damage amplifier role. Of course, it would have been extremely difficult to account for all of this happening when the paths were initially designed, but the fact that the system mechanics have not evolved alongside the game's characters is what has led us to this point. Debuffs and effect hit rate deserve to be reworked to give them back some kind of unique strength to call their own, but for the developers, there's no true incentive to do so. One suggestion I thought made a lot of sense was combining effect hit rate and effect resistance into a single stat, making those who build it more consistent defensively. It also wouldn't interfere at all with existing relics, making it fairly realistic. However, implementing such a change now would also be pretty futile at this point, because healers have progressed to a state where they already make incoming crowd control basically a non-issue. I suppose you could say that Acheron's teams heavily benefiting from Nihilty path characters and frequent debuff applications is a distinct gameplay role in a sense, but having that be entirely dependent on a single premium character doesn't really seem fair. Nihilty does still have the DOT archetype at the very least, but for its debuffing supports, they're practically forced to only work when the designers completely ignore what made them different in the first place, with design that is only roundabout because they won't fix the root of the problems. Like even with Silverwolf, they gave her additional scaling from EHR while also reducing the amount she needs because she previously had the highest requirements but didn't really get that much out of it. I don't know. Maybe it's just time to move on and accept that paths are not as much of a core part of the game's identity as they used to be, especially considering that 3.5 is yet another update with preservation nowhere to be seen. Subscribe for more Star Rail discussion videos, and I've also recently opened up channel memberships if you'd like to support me and get access to member-only community posts. But regardless, as always, thanks for watching.